Okay, can everyone hear me all right? All right, well, good morning. My name is Jeremy Twitchell, and I'm an energy research analyst at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. We work closely with Sandia National Lab on this energy storage program, and I'm happy to be here this morning to be able to share some information with y'all. So first, just as a reminder, for those who may not have been on past webinars, all of the work that we do on this energy storage program that we're presenting to you in these workshops is funded by the Office of Electricity, the Office of Electricity within the Department of Energy, under the leadership of Dr. Emmerjuk, and we're grateful for his continued support of this program and funding activities like this. So the agenda for today, first I'll provide just a brief overview of the storage program for those who may not have been here in the past. Then we'll talk about some federal policies related to energy storage that have developed recently, specifically FERC orders 841 and 845, and the policy statement that they issued a few years ago on dual-use storage. Then we'll move to the state level and do an overview of some of the state initiatives that are taking place on energy storage. And then, as requested by the commission here, we'll finish with a deep dive into a few of the initiatives around the country that have been led entirely by utility commissions and some of the different activities and approaches that they have undertaken. So first, the energy storage program comes out of a 2013 report commissioned by DOE that identified a lot of potential roles for energy storage in providing a flexible and resilient grid, but also identified 4 specific challenge areas that needed to be addressed in order to achieve that. So the first was the development of competitive storage technology, so better materials, new types of energy storage, validated reliability and safety, making sure that we have the codes and safety in place, fire codes, electric codes, and ensure that these devices are operated safely and reliably. The equitable regulatory environment, that's where myself and Howard and Will work. This is where we are trying to identify what are the regulatory barriers to energy storage. We've done things in the past, and what are some better ways of doing things in the future. And then finally, industry acceptance, which is partnering with utilities to understand, how do these devices actually work? What are the values they can provide to the grid? And how can we understand how to use these devices in a way that will optimize their value to the grid? So here you can see just a few examples of some of the engagements that we've had through the program, the partnerships we've developed at the university level and with utilities in states around the country. So federal policy. First, we heard there was a lot of interest in understanding what FERC has been doing on energy storage in recent years. So just by way of background, FERC has 2 primary areas of responsibility of regulatory authority. First is regulating the market design and operations and the deregulated market footprints that you see there on the left, with the exception, of course, of ERCOT, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas. ERCOT does not have any interconnections with other grids in the U.S., and so therefore they are not under FERC's jurisdiction because FERC's jurisdiction is dependent on interstate transmission of electricity. The second area of FERC's responsibility is in transmission system planning and operations and rate making. And this affects all areas of the country where interstate transmission takes place, whether they're vertically integrated or deregulated. And so you can see there, some on the right, the regional transmission planning organizations that are organized to comply with some of FERC's rules about regional transmission planning. And so this is important because FERC in recent years has used both of these areas to enable energy storage development and deployment. So first, Order 841. So FERC issued Order 841 in February of 2018. And the goal of that was to remove barriers to the participation of energy storage resources into capacity, energy, and ancillary services operated by the regional transmission organizations and independent system operators.
Hey, Jeremy, it's Howard. Can I interrupt for just a second? Would everybody please mute themselves? I'm trying to mute people, but I can't mute everybody. So please try to mute yourselves. And if you have questions, put them in the chat box. No, I can't just unmute Jeremy, it appears. So let me try. Let me try that, okay? Hold on just a second, Jeremy.
Okay.
Okay, I think everybody is muted now. Jeremy, speak, can you?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Okay. Oh, yeah, I can hear you. Okay, so go ahead.
All right. So FERC basically said to all these regional market operators, you have to come up with a way for energy storage to participate in your models, or excuse me, in your markets, for it to provide all the services that it is capable of providing. And so as FERC is reviewing these filings, they're looking for 7 basic criteria. So first, did the region create a clear participation model for energy storage, a way for it to engage in the markets that have been created? Second, does storage have access to all of the markets in which it can provide services? Is it able to access capacity markets, energy markets, ancillary services markets, and have those markets been designed in a way that reflect the capabilities of storage? Third, as these markets have been designed, as these products have been designed, did the region account for the unique physical and operation characteristics of energy storage? So here FERC is looking for things like, are they monitoring the device's state of charge? Are they accounting for how fast it can ramp? Are they accounting for its charging capabilities, its frequency response capabilities, things like that? Fourth, they're making sure that storage owners are allowed to self-manage their state of charge. What we saw in the early days was that these regions, when they were creating a product for energy storage, they would say, if you wanted to do frequency response, for example, you have to come in at a 50% state of charge so that you can go up and down. Well, what we've learned in recent years is you can actually start at like an 80 or 90% state of charge because you're just doing little movements up and down. You don't need to leave a lot of headroom in the system. And so the idea here is that if we allow these storage devices to understand, these owners to monitor their own state of charge, then they can provide that little bit of service on the top, but then they can also have this bit underneath that they can bid in to provide other services as well. And they're more capable of monitoring that and managing that than the ISO would be. Fifth, the idea was to create a minimum size requirement, no greater than 100 kilowatts. So allowing relatively small devices to be able to bid into the market, also allowing very small devices to aggregate to get up to that threshold and participate in the market as well. Sixth, they have to be able to demonstrate that they are accurately metering and charging energy storage devices. In order to do these kinds of things that FERC was telling them to do to create these kinds of markets, we need to have very granular ways of monitoring the output of energy storage devices, the input of energy storage devices, to understand when they're charging, when they're discharging, and charging them appropriately for the charging electricity and compensating them appropriately for the discharged energy. And then finally, FERC wanted these things to be effective within 1 year of their acceptance unless the ISO could demonstrate that longer would be necessary. And I can't advance my slide. Okay, there we go, sorry.
Just quick, Jeremy, I'm going to jump in for the folks on the phone. We're on slide 9 now. I know folks are coming in late, so I want to get them caught up so they can find where we are.
Oh, thank you, Molly. So where we are now, all 6 of these regional markets that are subject to Order 841 have made their initial filings. FERC has approved those filings, but they've also requested some additional compliance filings from each of the market areas to address a few minor issues that FERC identified in the initial round. And those additional filings have been made. FERC has not yet acted on them. And so that's where we are currently. So I just wanted to provide a brief run through of where each market region is, how they approached 841, the issues that FERC identified and asked them to follow up on. So in California, they were arguably the most far advanced in terms of creating market products for energy storage. And so in their filing, they basically said, look, we already have these products for non-generating resources, pump storage facilities, and demand response resources. And with a few minor tweaks, we can make them compliant with Order 841. And FERC generally agreed with that, but did ask CAISO to go back and fix a couple things. They needed to be clear that they were accounting for all the unique capabilities of energy storage, again, things like state of charge, ramp rate, and the various products. They needed to decrease the threshold for all of their market products to 100 kW. FERC found that one of them, their spinning reserve product, was still requiring a larger resource threshold. And then finally, they needed to make, CAISO needed to make sure that storage resources would not be double charged when charging, so they wouldn't be paying a wholesale rate and a retail rate. The Mid-Continent ISO, MISO, created a new participation model called the Electric Storage Resource Model to implement Order 841. FERC likewise accepted their model, but issued an order for a compliance filing to address a few minor issues. First, MISO had tried to do a cap on very small resources participating in this model. They tried to limit it to, I believe it was 50 such assets in the first year, and ramping up to about 150 in years after that. FERC said, no, you can't do that. You can't discriminate based on size. Also, some clarity on transmission charges. So FERC in Order 841 created a little bit of confusion, and you'll see this in multiple filings here. FERC said that when a storage device is charging on its own decision, just because energy is cheap at the moment, then it should pay transmission access charges for its use of the transmission system. But if the device is charging under the direction of the ISO, it's charging to provide regulation down services or frequency response services or something that requires it to take energy off the grid, then it shouldn't have to pay transmission charges. And you'll see that nuance was not very well communicated, and several of the regions were asked to go back and address that issue. And then finally, with MISO, FERC also asked them to go back and have a little more clarity around, okay, how are you going to meter these devices? How are you going to build these devices? How are you going to compensate these devices? And you can see both CAISO and MISO made their additional compliance filings on January 21st, and those are still undergoing review. So the New England ISO of New England, ISO-NE, they actually did a series of filings to comply with Order 841. They did one filing saying, okay, here's what we have in place that's already compliant with 841. Then they did a round of tariff adjustments that they had actually already been working on. They filed them shortly after Order 841 was issued. That adjusted some of their products to enable energy storage to better participate. And then they did kind of a cleanup filing at the end to say, all right, here are the last few boxes we need to check to comply with 841. And collectively, FERC accepted all of that, but like the other ISOs, they sent them back to do a little more work. Like CAISO, they said that ISO New England needed a little more clarity around how they were accounting for the operational characteristics of storage in their markets. Needed to address the issue of transmission access charging when the device is when the device is charging at the direction of the ISO, and then a little more information around how they plan to meter these devices and bill and compensate these devices. New York ISO proposed a new participation model, which they called the dispatch-only resource. FERC accepted that, but had a little more work to do with New York ISO. New York ISO had some stuff in their tariff about how they're going to aggregate resources to participate in the market. FERC said that, well, that's nice, but that's outside the scope of Order 841, so that you need to remove all of that. So that's not what we're doing here. Also, an issue that came up in the New York ISO was this idea of allowing storage assets to derate their capacity to meet minimum run times. So what that means is, like, so say I have a 1 megawatt 4 megawatt hour battery. So the way most people would read that is I can discharge at 1 megawatt for 4 hours to get 4 megawatt hours.
Good. What's up?
And can someone mute themselves, please? Thank you.
Okay.
But if I'm discharging at that full megawatt, if I'm discharging at the device's rated capacity, I'm not going to get 4 hours of duration out of it. I'm not going to get 4 megawatt hours. When you're looking at that 1 megawatt, 4 megawatt hours, you should read that slash is an or, not an and. So if I'm discharging at 1 megawatt, I might only be able to discharge the device for 3 hours.
Hey, can you do me a favor? I'm on actually a battery webinar
Michael,
right now from Maryland.
Michael, can you mute yourself, please?
I've got to go back to that. and then that's supposed to last till 2, and then Ronnie and I have a 2 to 3 meeting, talking actually about the schedule and the contract and everything.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so the idea is, so I can't push that device for 4 hours at its maximum rated capacity. So if an ISO has said, in order to participate, you need to be able to run for 4 hours, what I'm going to do is discharge that device at a lower level. Say, like, instead of the full megawatt, say I'm going to discharge it maybe like 750 kilowatts. And then by discharging at that lower rate, I can meet that 4-hour runtime. And so what FERC said is that ISOs need to have a mechanism for that. If you establish a minimum runtime, you need to let a device discharge at a lower capacity rating in order to meet that runtime. And they felt that the New York ISO had not done that at their initial filing. And then there's a few other issues you can see there. I don't want to get too bogged down on this. And New York ISO made its additional compliance filing on February 18th. So PJM, this is where it starts to get a little more interesting, as I'm sure many of you have heard. So PJM, like many of the other, like all of the other ISOs, had a few issues that FERC asked them to go back and address, especially how it was metering these devices, the issue of transmission charges, when those would be applied. But what came out of the PJM filing in particular was PJM indicated in their filing that when they're looking at a device's performance, they're doing it based on a 10-hour runtime. So, how does this device do over a continuous 10 hours of operation? And a lot of stakeholders in this proceeding, a lot of commenters felt that was unfair, particularly to energy storage devices, that it created an unfair barrier to energy storage. And so they asked FERC to tell PJM that they can't do that. And FERC said, well, that runtime issue is beyond the scope of 841. But the Federal Power Act does give FERC authority that if they're in any kind of proceeding, if they come across something that they feel is unjust or unfair, they can basically pull that issue out and initiate a separate proceeding to investigate it. And so that's what they did here. It's called Section 206 proceeding, Section 206 of the Federal Power Act. So what FERC did here is they pulled that question of the 10-hour runtime out and created a separate docket. You can see the number there, EL 19-100, where they're going to do an investigation into that 10-hour runtime practice and whether it's just and reasonable. And so PJM, so that issue has been pulled out of this, and so PJM made their additional compliance filing to address the other minor issues that you see there in December. Southwest Power Pool, somewhat similar to PJM, had an issue that came out of it that FERC pulled aside for a Section 206 investigation. And somewhat similar to PJM, it was about this issue of the runtime qualifications. So no one really had an issue with SPP's minimum runtime, which it was 4 hours. The problem that came out was that SPP only had that minimum runtime in their business practice manual, which is basically kind of like their guidebook for how they implement their tariffs. But what really governs how they act and how they treat these resources is what's in the tariff. And so FERC pulled that issue out and said, okay, if you're going to have that minimum runtime and be making decisions based on that minimum runtime, you need to put that in your tariff. And so that's another issue, EL 19-101, that has been pulled out for separate treatment. Okay. So before we move on from FERC, I wanted to talk briefly about a couple other recent actions they've done related to energy storage. First was Order 845, issued in April 2018. And if you ask around in the industry, there are people out there who argue that 845 does more for storage than 841 does. I'm not sure that I agree with that bold of a statement, but it does make some pretty big differences. So what 845 deals with large generation interconnection agreements. So basically every ISO, really every utility, any grid operator has these large generator interconnection agreements that govern how new large generating resources, anything 20 megawatts or higher, connect to the grid. And so in Order 845, FERC established some basic practices, some threshold practices that need to be included in those standard agreements. And so the main changes that they made with respect to energy storage, and I want to be clear, 845 is much, much, much bigger than energy storage. but it did do a few things specific to energy storage. First, for the first time, it defined energy storage as a generating resource, at least from an interconnection standpoint, so that these standard practices would also apply to energy storage. So that added a lot of clarity and consistent practice that hadn't been there before. Another thing it did is it said that a generator can interconnect to the grid at less than its nameplate capacity. So that's big for storage because say I have like a 20 megawatt solar farm and a 5 megawatt battery that I put with it. Traditionally, I would have had to interconnect at the full 25 megawatts of my nameplate capacity. What 845 does is say, if I want to interconnect at something less because I know I'm never going to actually put my nameplate capacity onto the grid, I can do that. So I can interconnect at, instead of 25 megawatts, just 20 megawatts, just the nameplate of the solar facility, and not count that battery storage toward my interconnection requirement. And what that does is that saves a lot of time and money because the smaller my interconnection, the easier the study is, the less expensive my interconnection is, and it also incents more effective, more efficient use of the transmission system. So now the transmission system, instead of having to set aside 25 megawatts for my facility that's never actually going to make 25 megawatts, now it's only setting aside 15, 20 megawatts. And so that excess capacity that normally would have been set aside for my facility can now be set aside for other facilities and used more efficiently. Another thing that FERC has done is the policy statement that they issued in January 2017. It has a really long title, but really what it's about is dual use energy storage, allowing energy storage to be a transmission asset, but also provide market services as well, generation services. There had been a few cases over the years where this issue had become somewhat confusing. In some cases, FERC had said yes, in other cases, FERC had said no. So the idea behind the policy statement was to establish some clarity for FERC to say, yes, energy storage can be a dual-use asset. It can be a regulated transmission asset and a competitive generation asset. But it has to be subject to these three principles. You can't have a double recovering cost, so it can't fully recover all its costs as a transmission asset, and then go recover its costs as a generator as well. You have to minimize adverse market impacts. It can't have unfair market access because of its transmission services. And the ISO has to be independent. The ISO can't be the one who's telling this device how to bid into the market and how to participate in the market. This policy statement was voluntary. It didn't require any action on anyone's part. Only two of the regions have tried to implement it, CAISO and MISO. CAISO's proceeding went for a little over a year, and then they ultimately suspended it because they just realized, in order for us to figure out how to do this, there are a lot of foundation issues that need to be addressed. We've never had a resource that can work in this regulated transmission space and this deregulated competitive generation space. We don't have any kind of participation model that allows a resource to go back and forth. And so CAISO realized that in order to create that kind of model, you need to do a lot of very foundational work in terms of market design and resource contracting, things like that. The MISO proceeding similarly started out trying to figure out this dual use storage. And then through the process, they decided that, well, right now we want to just look at storage as a transmission asset only. And if a device wants to provide multiple services, then it should be a generation asset. So essentially just kind of punting the issue down the road. And we actually have a project that we're doing through the Water Power Office at DOE where we're trying to investigate this issue and understand what would it take for a resource to actually be a dual use resource. So if anyone would like to talk more about this issue, I'd be happy to do that. All right, so moving on to the state level. First, just wanted to provide an overview of what's going on around the country. So this graph you see here is from a report that we issued last year where we tried to understand, what are states doing on energy storage? What are the different types of policies they're doing and why these different types of policies? And what this graph is communicating is that the orange line represents the installed costs of a lithium-ion battery. And so you can see that as those costs have fallen over years, and then that blue shape represents the deployment of battery energy storage, as that has increased over the years, you've seen state activity, state policy activity really start to increase, especially in the last 4 or 5 years. And so we've put together a database where we track some of these activities that's available at the website there. And so what we've done in this database is try to provide kind of a taxonomy for these different storage policies. What are the different types of policies that states do? And so what we found are these 5 basic types of policy, procurement targets, regulatory adaptation, demonstration programs, financial incentives, consumer protection. And I'll talk a little bit more about these in a moment. What we try to do in this database is just identify which states are doing which, and then provide some links for you to follow through and see, okay, what's the underlying legislation? What's the underlying commission docket? What was the rationale for this policy? So procurement targets, so these have generally been adopted in a state where the state has identified a need for energy storage for it to, a role that it can play in meeting state energy policies, and then also identified barriers to energy storage that mean that it's unlikely that need will be met. And so California, of course, was the first state to do this, 1325 megawatts by 2020. They adopted that back in 2013. The following year, they actually added an additional 500 megawatts of distribution connected storage. Since then, we've seen 6 other states adopt procurement targets. Most recently, Nevada, starting with 100 megawatts this year, ramping up to 100 megawatts a year until 1,000 megawatts in 2030. And then Virginia, with recently passed legislation that hasn't yet been signed, but setting the largest target to date at 3,100 megawatts by 2030. So regulatory adaptation, we'll do a deeper dive into this one, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. But the idea here is where someone, the legislature or the commission itself, has recognized some kind of regulatory practice that creates an impediment to energy storage, or a better way of doing things, and then starting to amend the regulations and adapt the regulations to energy storage. Demonstration programs, this is where the state is actually setting aside money to help utilities or some other partner to deploy energy storage. And usually that funding comes with an agreement that the utility, whoever's receiving the funding, is going to share their information, share their data with the state, so that the state can better understand, how did this device work, what were the benefits of the device, and how can we use these lessons to help inform future deployments. So you can see some of the major programs in this space have been the ACES program in Massachusetts, which provided $20 million to 26 different projects. And these projects were all kinds of different projects. There were large-scale front-of-the-meter utility-owned energy storage. There was small behind-the-meter residential energy storage. Just lots of different use cases they were testing out. Washington State had a clean energy fund that provided $14.3 million in cost sharing for 5 demonstration projects with utilities. And at PNNL, we've actually done a lot of work on this project. The state actually requested PNNL to do the economic analysis of these projects to understand what are the values, what was cost effective, what wasn't, and how can we better understand for future deployments. So financial incentives, these are state funded programs that go to the end user, go to end use customers for them to install behind the meter energy storage. The largest one in California's self-generation incentive program, which for years was designed to fund rooftop solar, rooftop PV, investments. Well, a few years ago, as California began to get into the proverbial duck curve and started to really struggle to manage all this solar that it had bought, they changed this program to be focused on energy storage to manage that solar. So they set aside almost $400 million in funding for behind-the-meter storage procurements in the state. Maryland, of course, a leader in terms of establishing the first tax rebate for energy storage in the country. And then a few other states that have done things like expand their existing solar incentives to also include energy storage incentives. That's been done in Nevada, Virginia, Vermont. So consumer protection, this is kind of a newer trend that we're seeing. This is where a state basically says that consumers have a right to install energy storage, and utilities, utility commissions have to make sure that there are reasonable interconnection processes to connect that storage to the grid. There can't be any kind of discriminatory rate to that energy storage. And so we've seen that done in Nevada and Colorado. And so finally, based on the feedback we received in the first workshop, I wanted to do a deeper dive into initiatives around the country that have been led by a utility commission. You know, these are initiatives we've seen where the utility commission has acted on its own motion and established, you know, new policies or new regulatory approaches to better understand storage or to enable energy storage. So the first one here is Hawaii. So what Hawaii did is they changed the way they do their net metering in order to use storage to balance all the rooftop PV. So the issue we had in Hawaii, or that they had in Hawaii, was that on a per capita basis, Hawaii has far more distributed generation than anyone else in the country. You know, almost, you know, about 2.5 times what they have in California on a per capita basis. And so what they were starting to see were some pretty severe grid impacts from that. This idea of under-frequency load shedding, which is basically every time a big cloud passes over the islands and cuts off all that solar temporarily, they had to start dropping load in order to rebalance the grid when all that solar dropped off. And even now, you'll see that happening quite frequently on the islands. It's this under-frequency load shedding. So what the commission did was say, all right, that traditional net metering model where we're paying a retail rate for all the energy that comes onto the grid isn't in our interest anymore. So they terminated that. They grandfathered in everyone who was on it, but they closed it to new participants, and they created these 4 alternative programs. So this first one is customer self-supply, and this is where the customer keeps all of their generation on their own property. Nothing goes to the grid. Second one is controllable grid supply. So this one, a customer can export to the grid, and they will receive some compensation. It's closer to an avoided cost rate than a retail rate. But the key is that they have to agree to allow the utility or a third party control their generation and curtail it when needed by the grid. The third program is the Smart Export Program, which allows customers to export to the grid and be compensated for it at a slightly higher rate, but they can only do it between the hours of 4 p.m. and 9 a.m. Basically, you know, the evening hours, the overnight hours. And then they also created this enhanced net energy metering program, which says, okay, if you were grandfathered into the traditional net metering program, you can add additional capacity to your system, additional PV, additional storage, as long as that additional capacity does not increase what you're putting onto the grid. So essentially, if I'm a resident in Hawaii and I want to put solar on my house, I essentially have 2 options. Either I can control all that, I have to control my generation, or I have to let the utility control my generation. So if I want to control the generation of my PV system, I have to install energy storage. I have to have a means of either keeping all that generation on site or controlling and shaping that generation to only go out to the grid at certain times. So California, as we all know, was the first state to do a procurement target, a mandate for energy storage. But what was interesting is they actually came back almost 5 years later, just in 2018, and said that, okay, I'm sorry, someone's creating, Rania, can you mute yourself, please? Sorry about that. So 5 years after the mandate went into place, California regulators came back and said, all right, we need to have a little more clarity about how we're modeling energy storage, how we're identifying these values. And the reason they did that is because, you know, several years into the mandate, this low-hanging fruit, you know, these places where you had this like single high-value application for energy storage, you know, something like replacing the lost gas storage at Aliso Canyon, or deferring a transmission project at a very constrained site in an urban area. You know, things like that. Those high-value projects had been taken. And so they needed to be a little more granular and a little more deliberate about how they were selecting projects going forward, about how they were identifying all the values that a device could provide and identifying where those cost-effective opportunities remain. So what the commission did is they adopted 11 new rules for utilities to use when valuing the multiple uses of energy storage. And I just kind of summarized them here, but what they said is that, okay, a storage device that's connected at any point to the grid, generation, transmission, distribution, can provide service to any one of those levels. The only exception is that if I'm connected at the customer level, if I'm connected at the distribution transmission level, I can't provide service at the customer level. Other than that, it's fluid. Reliability services are primary. Those take priority over any other service that storage can provide, and they're mutually exclusive, meaning that if there's a reliability service that I'm providing with the storage device, I cannot commit it to provide any other service that might conflict with that reliability obligation. Finally, third, they said that storage devices can subdivide that capacity. So I can take like 20% of my capacity and say, all right, I'm going to bid this into frequency response, and I'm going to bid this 30% into the capacity market, and I'm going to bid this into deferring a local distribution project. Allowing that kind of behavior to take place, but also requiring transparency, saying that if I, as a storage owner, am going to do that, I have to let everyone that I'm selling that capacity to know that I'm subdividing and selling to these other people as well. And then finally, these services, all these services that storage can provide, they have to be individually compensated, and double compensation cannot occur. So the result of this is that, utility modeling of storage is improved. California utilities are among the national leaders in terms of being able to really identify the multiple uses, values of energy storage. And then these rules were also used to inform storage proceedings taking place at the California ISO, including for Gate 41 compliance. So Washington State. So the issue here was that so in Washington State, they do integrated resource plans. So every 2 years, investor-owned utilities file a plan saying, here's our plan for the next 20 years, here's the load we're seeing, here's how we plan to meet it. And for several of those 2-year cycles, regulators in Washington State had been saying, what about storage? Are you considering storage? And the utilities were basically like, it's not time yet, it's too expensive, we're not ready for it. The regulators asked after the 2011 cycle, the utility said no. After the 2013 cycle, the utility said no. And in the 2015 cycle, it was becoming apparent that storage wasn't really a factor yet. And so the commission put together, so first off, staff put together this white paper saying, look, commission, you keep telling utilities to consider energy storage. Here's why they're not doing it. The models they're using, they can't do energy storage. They don't have enough granularity to really capture the benefits of energy storage. So you can't do it with these current models. So we need to be more specific about the type of guidance that we give them. So what the commission did in response was put together a policy statement that establishes clear expectations for how the utility should be viewing storage in their planning and what they should be doing to identify cost-effective opportunities. And so the commission opened with this clear statement saying, look, energy storage is a key component of reaching the state's energy goals. And so we expect utilities to be developing the means to identify cost-effective opportunities for deploying storage in support of those goals. So what that means is over time, utilities should be moving to much more granular planning models, sub-hourly models that can do distribution system modeling, really diving into the locational values of energy storage as well as the temporal values of energy storage. Recognizing that that's going to take some time and represents a fairly significant investment, the commission also set forth some incremental steps that they expected utilities, things like the net cost method, where we're saying, okay, the IRP doesn't capture all the benefits of energy storage. It captures a few of the benefits, but then you can get, a model there are several free models out there from multiple entities. PNNL has models, Sandia has models, EPRI has models. There's all these models out there where you can identify the additional values of energy storage, the flexibility values, the locational values, the things that the IRP model doesn't do. So you can take your IRP model, take your secondary model, and just identify what those other values are, and then just kind of input those into the IRP model. The result of this, 2 of these utilities that as recently as 2013 refused to model energy storage in their plans, by their 2017 IRP, we're selecting and identifying cost-effective opportunities for energy storage, following this commission guidance. The final state I wanted to dive into is Arizona. This one's really interesting to me. I should have mentioned up front, prior to joining the lab, I actually worked for a utility commission. I worked at the utility commission in Washington State, and I worked on this project I just talked about. So as a former regulator, this Arizona one just fascinates me. You had a rate case fight that turned into this behind-the-meter energy storage pilot program, which I'm not aware of happening anywhere else. So what happened is, in a 2017 rate case, Arizona Public Service, the state's largest utility, proposed a ratchet on demand charges paid by large commercial customers. If you haven't heard of what a ratchet is, basically, large commercial customers pay a demand charge, which is based on what their peak demand every year. Now, if I, as a customer, reduce my demand, I can reduce the charges I'm paying to the utility. But what a ratchet does is say, okay, so if your demand was here and then it went to here, we're going to slowly reduce what we bill you for over the space of 1, 2, 3 years, depending on how it's designed. So these are very unpopular with customers, and they certainly were in this case, because the customers feel like, so even if I reduce my demand, it still may be years before I see the benefits of that. And so it was a fight in this case. And so what APS did to get a settlement was say, okay, we understand that. So let's let the ratchet go into place. But what we'll do is create this pilot program where for 3 years, we'll set aside $2 million a year, and we'll actually help large commercial customers deploy behind-the-meter energy storage to manage their demand charges. And so the customer signed on to that. The commission approved that. And you can see some of the details there. We're getting short on time, so I won't run through all the details. But so the result of this program, which is, this pilot program has ended, but what came out of it is Arizona Public Services actually created a bring your own storage tariff for large commercial customers, which basically allows any customer to deploy energy storage on their site and then get lower rates, lower demand charge rates, because they're reducing their demand. They're allowing the utility to control that device, manage demand to reduce grid impacts. And then also APS has developed a similar $4 million a year program for residential customers to deploy energy storage and participate in demand response programs. So just a few additional resources there. You can see our websites at PNNL and Sandia, where we keep track of all these reports, all this research that we're doing. The Energy Storage Exchange that Sandia operates on behalf of DOE. That's basically a wiki site where you can go and see what storage is being deployed around the country. And Sandia does a really good job of verifying entries and making sure that it's that there's some reliability to the information there. But it's an interesting site to play on. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions. I saw a couple come through.
Yeah, Jeremy, you have 2 questions. One is from Delegate Charkoudian. It says, it's my understanding that storage has never cleared PJM capacity markets. I believe this is related to the 10-hour rule. Has storage cleared capacity markets in other ISOs? Which ones? And how do their capacity rules compare to PJM?
Oh, that is a great question. Yeah, you've done your homework. So yes, it has not cleared the capacity market in PJM. Storage has been deployed in a lot of the ancillary services markets in PJM, but you're correct, it has not cleared a capacity market. The only place I can think of off the top of my head where it has cleared a capacity market is in CAISO, but CAISO's capacity markets work different than the rest of the country. CAISO is kind of like more of like a hybrid market where they don't have like the forward capacity auction like you have in PJM, like you have in some of the other ones. But what they do is, so the California Energy Commission basically says, here's the load forecast, here's the resource need that we have. And then the California PUC basically assigns each utility, okay, here's how much capacity you have to meet, here's how much capacity you have to meet, et cetera. And so storage has come in as a cost-effective capacity resource through that process, but it hasn't, I'm not aware of anywhere where it has cleared a traditional capacity auction type situation. That's not to say it hasn't.
Dave Littell here. In New England, Sunrun put a bid in for solar plus storage that did clear.
Okay.
So that's obviously a high.
Okay. Thank you. I thought there might be one up there, but I didn't want to speak out of turn. So, yeah, I hope that helps. I hope that answers the question.
So her second question is, and this may be something that Will is planning on handling in the next presentation, so feel free to put a pin if we need to. Can you comment on how the recent MOPR ruling affects our ability as state lawmakers to support increased storage capacity in the energy mix?
MOPR. I went back and forth on trying to include MOPR, decided against it. I wasn't sure I'd have time for it. So for those who don't know, MOPR is the minimum offer price rule. And it's been quite controversial. It was something that PJM proposed to use in limited circumstances, that PJM has used in limited circumstances in the past, but that FERC recently issued an order saying that, okay, you have to apply this to all resources. And essentially what MOPR does is say that any state subsidy for a resource has to be included when that resource is bidding into the market. So I think my answer to your question would be it's going to require states, state policymakers to be maybe a little more creative in how they support different resources. If there is a desire to support and promote energy storage or to enable energy storage in markets, just providing a cash incentive from the state might not be the best way to do it under a MOPR regime. You might need to look at something like, hopefully that's these resources that we've pointed to in terms of what other states have done. Hopefully there will be something there that will spark some interest or maybe give you some ideas for how you might do it. But yeah, a straight cash incentive might not be the best way to do it right now.
David, since we've already got you on audio and video, I know you had a question. Do you want to go ahead?
Sure. I don't want to make this complicated, but I was just wondering, for consumer connected batteries, you noted in California, this is a question in California, that they can serve either of the other two domains. And I was wondering if a consumer like an industrial or commercial invests in the battery for their own use, is there can they have to reserve that usage for their own use, or does the effect of that rule mean that they get it for their own use but could sell it at essentially as secondary usage, or using an gas pipelines for non-firm transportation capacity? It's used there.
Okay. Yeah, so this was actually one of the controversial points of 841. Anyone who's followed is probably aware that NARUC and some other entities actually challenged Order 841, because one of the things that 841 said is, customer connected resources, distribution system connected resources can provide market services, can provide bulk energy services. And NARUC and some states felt that FERC had overstepped, that they could not reach into the distribution system, which has historically been subject to state regulation, and say that these resources can compete. There's a lot of back and forth. There's a lot of argument. I view it as FERC was saying these resources, like an ISO has to enable these resources to participate in markets. Whether they do or not is still up to the state. So there's that first hurdle of, is the state going to allow these behind the meter resources to participate in regional markets? And then from the technical standpoint of what can the resource do, there's going to be trade-offs. If I as a commercial customer procured this device to do certain things for me, I'm going to have to be very deliberate about how I bid it into the market and what services I offer and when they offer them. Because if I bid it into the market and I'm selected, but then I pull it back to meet the needs that I need or that I have, I'm going to pay some pretty severe penalties. So you have to be very careful about understanding, okay, here's what I need, here's what the market needs, and what are the trade-offs? When does it make sense for me to bid into the market, and when should I keep it here for my needs? And there's a lot of analytical tools out there and a lot of help to answer questions like that.
So it sounds like under those rules, there's a prohibition on sale for secondary use, is another way to say it.
I'm sorry, one more time?
There would be a prohibition on on a sale for secondary usage, or for non-firm capacity to use the gas pipeline.
Yeah. So when you're talking about, like something for a reliability need, something like, meeting a capacity need, there's really no such thing as non-firm capacity. We have that in the transmission sense, but from when we're talking about system reliability, there's firm and there's nothing. So yeah, I don't think there's any kind of product where you could bid it in on a non-firm basis that I'm aware of.
All right, so thanks everyone. I opened it up on the chat if there were any other questions and we didn't get anything else in. So let's take a 5-minute break. Thank you so much, Jeremy.
Yeah, happy to do it. Thank you for the opportunity.
I think we're all learning a lot, and I think we're enjoying the presentation so far. So let's come back at 1:07, and we'll start up with Will's deep dive into some of the policy issues.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's what I would be worried about. Don't worry about those tax docs, but
So clearly, ownership policy in Maryland around energy storage still needs to be developed. There are deadlines in place for utilities to submit their pilot proposals. The projects are scheduled to be operational by February 28, 2022. And really one of the key policy questions that the pilot process is expected to address is whether utilities in Maryland can own energy storage if it has any of the applications of generation. So it's very helpful, in my opinion, to look at what other states have already done with regard to ownership policy. And typically, ownership issues have been considered along with a state procurement mandate within a restructured marketplace. Now, this is not always the case, and so obviously we're seeing in Maryland that there's not a procurement mandate, but the issue of ownership is being discussed. Generally, in the 6 states that have gone before, ownership policy has been established within the context of a restructured marketplace and a storage mandate. And I'm going to go through each of these states quickly to inform you on what the state's policy is regarding energy storage. So just again, to be very clear, what is the policy issue that we're talking about here? And historically, because energy storage could be classified as a generation asset in a restructured marketplace in which utilities have been required to divest their generation assets, should we now, with the new technology of energy storage quickly emerging, should utilities have ownership rights to energy storage? And as regulators, you undoubtedly will hear arguments on the pro side and arguments on the con side. My stars here are just to tee up what I think are some of the key issues that I wanted to touch on. On the arguments promoting utility ownership, frequently we hear that there's the opportunity for long-range system-wide planning. If utilities are in the ownership position, they have an opportunity to optimize the distribution grid. They're in the best position to know where energy storage should be sited from a localized level. There are enhanced economies of scale. In other words, with the larger utility projects, we'll continue to see prices drop. Utilities have a lower cost of financing. But then you have the con side and groups that would argue against utility ownership. Typically, their primary argument would be concerns around market power. If you have utility ownership, would that preclude third-party participation? If you have utility ownership, would that inherently create a focus on reliability services and therefore prevent or diminish other applications for storage? There's uncertainties around cost recovery, and until those issues are addressed, utilities may be reticent to plunge into an ownership model as well. Nevertheless, policy is being developed in a number of states. California was the first to really carve out policy specific to ownership. As Jeremy talked about, the mandate in California speaks to both in front of the meter storage and behind the meter storage. When it comes to ownership, California has restricted utility ownership to 50% of any individual storage asset across the three domains of transmission, distribution, and customer-focused energy storage. There is some cross-providing of services that's allowed and accompanying compensation. And as Jeremy talked about, it's basically that the participants can play up rather than down. So if an owner has a distribution asset for storage, they can both contribute from the distribution side and also go up to the transmission side, but not go a step lower. The California ISO also allows aggregations of distributed energy storage to participate in both the energy and ancillary services market, as Jeremy discussed. Massachusetts is another reference point that is very important. In Massachusetts, legislation was passed in 2017 to explicitly allow storage among distribution utilities. This is very unique for a restructured state that was previously requiring utilities to divest their generation. So this is an explicit legislative statute that allows utilities to own energy storage. So very key. Energy storage technologies is included among a category of grid modernization assets that's eligible for rate recovery if it's justified with a business case that includes all quantifiable and unquantifiable benefits and costs. So what's important here is that in Massachusetts, it's clear utilities can own energy storage, they can submit for cost recovery as long as they have a justifiable business case. In New Jersey, regulators have gone on record saying they believe it's important to provide for various ownership models, including both ownership by distribution utilities and third parties. So we're seeing that emerge where New Jersey really wants to see a combination of both models rather than giving preference to one or the other. In New York, very important marketplace. Of course, the energy storage ownership issue has to be considered within the broader REV policy of New York, in which competitive ownership, in other words, non-utility ownership, that's a core principle of the REV policy. Regulators in New York have not wanted utilities to own energy storage or other distributed energy resources. New York wants the utilities to be neutral about which DERs are connected to the grid. There are some limited exceptions for utility ownership that can be pursued by a utility if they can make the case that it's really needed for reliability purposes. But generally speaking, in New York, utilities are outside of an ownership model. In Oregon is very similar to Maryland in the sense that it's directed the utilities in Oregon to consider multiple ownership options and submit various proposals to the Oregon PUC. That's a process that's currently taking place with Portland General Electric and Pacific Corp. They are submitting procurement proposals, including both ownership, utility ownership, and third-party ownership. Now, interestingly, Portland General Electric has argued against third-party ownership and has made the case that they really have great concerns about forfeiting their right to own storage assets. They've given examples that if there are equipment malfunctions from a third-party owned asset, would that put PGE personnel at risk? Could PGE be held jointly liable if there's any environmental issues? So the utilities are lobbying for utility ownership rights in Oregon. That's a process that's still undergoing. In Virginia, the latest state to have the procurement mandate still needs to be approved by the governor. Interestingly, Virginia is a restructured state that has kind of taken steps to go back into a re-regulated model. Virginia utilities had been required to divest their generation, but policy is now emerging that utilities may be allowed to own energy storage. There is some heavy lobbying among Dominion, as one example, in Virginia to even extend that to other forms of asset ownership. So that's continuing to evolve. Virginia has announced that traditional cost of service rate making will completely need to be revised to enable energy storage. And I'm going to delve into that in more detail when I get to the rate making implications of ownership models. But that gives you a sense of those states that have restructured their marketplace. They have really strong developing energy storage policy. Other states that I would want to draw to your attention outside of a procurement mandate, certainly Texas deserves to be on the radar. Texas has become a battleground on the issue of utility ownership. Texas law defines energy storage as generation. Due to restructuring that took place in Texas, T&D utilities cannot own generation. There's no capacity market in Texas, but nevertheless, AEP Texas has lobbied to own storage assets. The PUC began a review of this, but said, well, we're not going to rule on it. We're going to defer to the Texas legislature. So that issue still sits before the Texas legislature. No decision has been made. But ironically, there's a new law in Texas that allows municipals and cooperatives to own energy storage. So there's a real dichotomy here that needs to be figured out in Texas, and that's why it's such a focal point on this issue. Other models that I would draw to your attention would be Colorado. The utilities in Colorado, specifically Xcel Energy, have submitted to the commission a plan to replace all of their coal-fired generation fleet with utility-owned energy assets, including energy storage assets. So under that model in Colorado, utilities would own energy storage. In New Hampshire, it's a very unique model in that the New Hampshire PUC has approved a pilot program by Liberty Utilities in which the utility will own battery storage systems that are located on residential premises. So even though they're customer sited, the utility has ownership rights. So a very interesting model there as well. Let's go to the next slide here. And from a high level, the ownership issue prompts a number of policy considerations for state regulators. So that's why we're talking about this issue. How can state regulators ensure that utilities do not gain an opportunity for market manipulation or stifling competition among third parties if they're in a position of owning energy storage assets? In other words, how can state regulators ensure that a level playing field exists? What are the regulatory limitations of a rate-based investment process that's specific to energy storage? What are the rate-making implications that utility ownership of energy storage will create? And how would the rate basing of energy storage investments drive down market valuation for these services? So these are, policy issues that really have to be considered and will very likely be considered in Maryland as this pilot process continues. There there are some important granular issues on this topic that I would also suggest regulators need to be thinking about. And the first question is, well, what determines regulatory jurisdiction over energy storage? Is it going to be the states? Is it going to be FERC? How do you handle the dual participation issue? And I think the first issue to establish is whether or not that state is restructured or vertically integrated. I think that sets the context for regulatory oversight. Now, of course, in Maryland, we're talking about a restructured marketplace. And so that really does set the tone for a lot of these questions. Decisions around whether or not energy storage is treated as a generation asset, a transmission asset, or a distribution asset, or a hybrid, is also going to affect jurisdictional oversight and determinations of cost recovery. In restructured markets, generally speaking, storage assets that is considered a generation asset would likely be intended to participate primarily in the wholesale marketplace and therefore be subject to FERC and RTO marketplaces. Same thing for transmission. If it's clearly a transmission asset that would tend to fall under RTO, ISO jurisdiction. And then if the asset is intended to support distribution operations, that would fall under state regulatory oversight. Now, there's not one size fits all approach to this because the determination of the classification of energy storage is highly dependent on where it's located across the system, which is in turn correlated with the applications and the value proposition of the energy storage system that's being evaluated. Likewise, an individual storage asset can have hybrid classifications, as I said. So it could be devoted partially to support reliability at the distribution grid, but then also that same asset has opportunity to play in the wholesale marketplace. But determination of classification is really a driver on this regulatory issue. Now, we talk a lot about multiple service applications for energy storage, and this is an issue that is directly tied into the ownership issue. So to level set, this is an emerging area for policy making in multiple jurisdictions, but there are some trends that are developing, and the trends are identifying what are specific applications for energy storage, what are the value propositions that energy storage can provide within certain sectors. And so you see on the screen, on the left side, we have the bulk energy services, we have ancillary services, we have transmission and distribution, and then customer energy management services. And so based on my previous slide, you can start thinking about, well, if an energy storage asset is going to provide distribution infrastructure services, such as voltage support, such as conservation voltage reduction, there's a case that can be made that that falls under the state regulatory jurisdiction. If we're talking about transmission value propositions and transmission upgrade deferral or congestion relief, there's a case that can be made that that falls under the RTO and FERC jurisdiction. So you can see how the application of where the storage asset is going to be used and how really does have regulatory jurisdiction implications. So how does ownership impact regulatory oversight and wholesale opportunities? Now, the 4 models that are presently under consideration in Maryland have different implications. So going back to the 4 models that are going to be reviewed under these pilot proposals, if it's a utility-owned model, that seems pretty clear-cut that that would be PUC oversight. Would there be wholesale opportunities? Potentially, if the asset's not being used for its primary distribution reliability, which is the priority service. This is theoretically what one would anticipate under a utility-owned model. Under the utility third-party hybrid model, the PUC would typically have oversight over the distribution reliability services, and then when the third party wants to participate in the wholesale market, that would be outside of the state's jurisdiction. Third-party owned model would have very limited PUC oversight because the PUCs do not regulate these third-party developers. So energy storage would likely be primarily used for wholesale transactions, but then could support distribution reliability as well. It would really be up to the owner to decide based on potential profit opportunities. Under the virtual power plant model, again, these are the aggregated, customer-sided, multiple distribution sources of energy storage. One would think that the PUC would have pretty strong oversight over that. If the utility controls the aggregation, it's likely that distribution reliability would take priority. And so that's the way I think that model would likely play out. So within the context of regulatory jurisdiction, how will energy storage value streams be prioritized? This is a question that Molly and I have spent some time discussing, and in my opinion, the very term prioritized connotes regulation, that there's some body saying we will give precedence to certain services over others. Now, in restructured markets, such as Maryland, it's likely that the T&D utilities would prioritize their own distribution reliability services, which are regulated by state commissions. Third parties would theoretically and likely prioritize the storage generation services that can be sold into the wholesale market, or transmission services that would support an RTO or ISO. There will likely be multiple answers to the prioritization issue, given that the answer depends on where the facility is located and who owns it, who manages it. Undoubtedly, state and federal regulators are going to continue to need to work together to address the dual participation issue, the double counting issue, to ensure that payment, cost recovery for the particular asset is very cleanly addressed, and there isn't this opportunity for double counting across retail markets and wholesale markets. Now, on the prioritization issue, I'll go back to Oregon. Along with directing the distribution utilities to provide and submit multiple ownership models, the state of Oregon also came out with guidance. This is coming from the PUC, guidance on how energy storage services should be treated and which services should be given preference. First and foremost, from the Oregon PUC's perspective, is localized reliability. So avoiding local outages is the primary service that energy storage should provide in the Oregon PUC's opinion. Second to that would be supporting congestion and curtailment strategies on both the T&D grids. And then third would be addressing the dynamics of peak demand periods. Now, that's not to say that other services won't be considered in Oregon. It's just to say that this is how the Regulatory Commission is going to approach those proposals and the priority that would be given to certain services over others. Now, Portland General Electric just did submit a filing in December 2019. It's still before the PUC's review, but in that filing, PGE stated its intention to subsequently include energy storage acquisitions in its annual revenue requirements, and it's going to include the fixed cost of the energy storage asset and associated transmission costs. So it's going to include things like the return on investment with the capital costs, the O&M costs, property tax. All of that's going to be bundled into a PGE proposal that would be submitted to the PUC with the intention of getting cost recovery through rate base for those investments. Jeremy also talked about the California value stacking rules. They also give preference and priority to reliability services. So you see a consistency there in how those two states are approaching how to prioritize energy storage. Another big topic that falls under this area of utility ownership is how utility ownership is going to impact rate making. By definition, utility ownership of energy storage would allow for cost recovery through rates, in my opinion. If utilities are given ownership rights or directed to own energy storage, certainly a cost case can be made for cost recovery through rate base. However, we run into this problem of traditional rate making, which has been in place for decades, that relies on a cost of service study, revenue requirements. Frequently, there's a regulatory lag that takes place, and there's infrequent opportunities for rate increases. That traditional model doesn't lend itself to energy storage or other distributed energy resources that are now playing such an important role in the infrastructure. Traditional rate making would typically award or reward utilities for investing in large capital-intensive projects. Again, that's a contrary model to what we're looking at with smaller distribution-based investments, including energy storage. So the point here is that alternative rate-making mechanisms will very likely need to be developed to provide some level of commensurate cost recovery for utilities, and to provide some pathway forward that offers regulatory assurance that the investment is going to be considered prudent. And so that is a whole other process of undertaking that will need to take place when we look at rate making. There's multiple ways to go about this. Different states are doing it in different ways. The trends that I am seeing, and we saw this with the emergence of solar power in the last few years, and now the same concept is being applied to energy storage, that certain alternative rate-making approaches are rather quick fixes, rather easy fixes, and can be rather immediately applied to regulatory needs. One would be revenue decoupling. I'm sure we've all heard that term. Essentially, it's removing the disincentives for utilities to promote energy efficiency, protecting utility recovery of fixed costs. So where a utility is not driven by its sales, but rather investments that really are making more sense. So decoupling is one approach. Performance-based rate making, where the Regulatory Commission would set a number of goals or achievements or desired outcomes. It could very well be integrating energy storage. It could be focusing on renewables. It could be enhancing resilience. But in any event, tying the opportunity for rate increases for the utilities into some sort of official performance metrics that the Regulatory Commission is going to set and evaluate. Other alternative forms of rate making that are emerging that I think are particularly relevant would be multi-year rate plans. That's allowing for a utility to true up its actual cost of service once every 3 to 5 years, with automatic rate adjustments occurring in the interim. Again, it's providing that level of certainty to utilities that they would have opportunity to recover their costs. Cost trackers, I think, are also a good consideration. They allow utilities to use a formula or predefined rule to recover specific costs outside of a general rate case. So there are other forms, and I'd be happy to have offline discussions about how they may be considered specifically within Maryland, but generally that gives you some thinking around the kinds of rate making revisions that might be necessary. So as I conclude, some final thoughts on the question of utility ownership that I would leave you with. How can state regulators ensure consistency with the evolving regulations that are coming out of FERC on Order 841 that impact dual participation and compensation for multiple value streams? Jeremy spoke in great detail about that and how, particularly within the PJM marketplace, those rules are still very fluid and needing to be formalized. So it's going to be critically important that state regulators remain engaged in that process and determine how the federal policymaking has implications for the state level policymaking. Secondly, if an energy storage asset is capable of providing both retail and wholesale services simultaneously, can it provide those services across both state and regulatory jurisdictions? Again, boils down to the dual participation issue, but who's going to set those rules and policies? Another thought that I would leave you with is that when we look at all of these various states, I think an argument could be made that the model that's offered by New York, in which the utilities remain technology neutral, they generally do not own distributed energy resources, but serve as a grid traffic cop. Does that provide the best solution going forward for this evolving industry? I think an argument could be made on that as well, that to get utilities out of the ownership role completely, but have them have a hand in monitoring the distribution grid. Is that an effective approach? Time will tell if it works in New York, but it's certainly a model that I think is unique and deserves some consideration. So with that, as you undoubtedly know, the energy storage policy landscape continues to evolve. Sandia monitors all the policy activity at the federal and state level. We have a database that includes not only deployment data, but policy information. The link is provided here on the slide. I encourage you to go there. I have conducted analysis of Maryland, and that is publicly available. And finally, I would just like to echo, as Jeremy said, that the research in my presentation has been funded by the Department of Energy, Office of Electricity, under the sponsorship of Dr. Emery Zook, and we absolutely appreciate his support and sponsorship on this issue. So I'd be happy to open it up to any questions that you may have in the time that we have left.
Will, if you want to check your chat, it looks like there's another one from Delegate Charkoudian.
Okay, let me see if I can get there.
I can read it. It says, do any state statutes or regulations explicitly address equity issues in storage policies, specifically considering how storage can be implemented in a way that directly benefit underserved and frontline communities in terms of economic, environmental, and resiliency benefits, or focusing
Excellent.
deployment to prioritize shutting down dirtier peaker plants with environmental health impacts on more vulnerable communities?
Excellent question, very important topic. The only state that I have seen give really specific attention to that issue is Illinois. I have seen policy discussions within the context of the Illinois Corporation Commission that is specifically identifying that issue, how energy storage can be used to support underserved populations. Undoubtedly, this is going to be an issue that's going to continue to be raised. I think it's a very important issue. I've also seen it used or come up somewhat tangentially in discussions around state-level subsidies, and if certain state-level subsidies should be earmarked for the underserved populations. But fascinating topic, important topic. I see a lot more attention given to it, and it's something that I did take as an action item myself to really devote more attention to and develop some thought pieces on that. So thanks for asking that question.
All right, I don't see any more questions in the chat. If anybody wants to unmute and go ahead and ask questions out loud, that's acceptable as well. It's easier in this format than in the previous one. So we'll give
Molly.
it one more minute or so. Looks
Molly,
like
can
Commissioner
you-
O'Donnell has a question.
Yeah, so, Will, I asked you on the chat, I don't know if you saw it, but how far along are California and Massachusetts in meeting their 2020 procurement targets?
Well, I believe that California has already met its target. They're not putting into place any additions to that target that was established, but the last information that I had was that they have met it. Not sure on Massachusetts. Possibly my colleagues here on the line might have more information on that. And I believe that we would be tracking that data in our database as well. But California is either very closely there or has met it at this point.
Thank you.
All right, any other questions? All right, well, I'm going to give everybody back about 10 minutes of their day. So thank you so much, Will and Jeremy. We really appreciate these. The deep dives are getting into some of the issues we're going to be considering when we see our filings in April. So thank you so much, everyone. And keep an eye out, same time next week. I have no idea what channel we're going to be on, but I've sent an email around with an invite, and I do apologize for the confusion at the beginning of the setup. All right, everyone, have a great day.
Thanks, Molly. Bye-bye.
Thank you.